The Great Chicago Fire was one of the most impactful and important fires in American history. It occurred on October 8th in 1871 and lasted until October 10th. It destroyed over 17,500 buildings and burned for 3 square miles. It began on 137 DeKoven Street in the south side of Chicago after a woman was milking her cow and it kicked over a lit lantern, engulfing the area in flames. It quickly spread, sending chaos about the south side of Chicago and spread north, heading straight towards the dense, more populated areas. From June to October, Chicago only experienced 1 inch of rain. This dry, hot atmosphere would make the perfect equation for disaster. The city of Chicago was very lucky because on the second day of the fire it began to rain, which helped a lot towards the extinguishing of the fire. Without the rain, most likely all of Chicago would have ended up being destroyed.
On October 8th, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire started. This would end up being one of the most devastating fires in history. The result of this fire is over 100,000 people homeless and 300 casualties. It took over 2 years to rebuild the city, as it destroyed 1/3 of Chicago and amounted to $5.2 billion in damages. This event also took away the rights of the community to live safe and pushed the responsibilities of citizens to come together and rebuild the city.
The O'Learys were a poor family. Patrick O'Leary was a laborer, and Catherine O'Leary sold milk from their cows to their neighbors. They had a small barn behind their house that held only 5 cows. They were on welfare, but when the government found out about her selling milk, they ended their benefits. When the fires began, the officer's first concern was Miss O'Leary, believing that she still had a grudge against the city and wanted to take revenge. Her alibi was that her family was asleep when it happened, and they had no idea that the fire had started. With over 1,000 handwritten testimonies of over 50 people, the Board of Police had decided that, quote, whether it originated from a spark blown from a chimney on that windy night, or was set on fire by human agency, we are unable to determine, end quote, Board of Police, 1871. The Board of Police deemed her not guilty, however the community still believed that she was the one to blame. Before the Great Chicago Fire started, one of the reasons it got so out of hand is because one day prior, there was a smaller, less intense fire that only lasted for a small amount of time. There had been many fires previously throughout the summer, but this last one really took all of their effort to extinguish. Because of the foundations of the houses back then being mainly made out of wood, they were kindling for the fire, and it were a very important reason why it burned so badly. Another reason was that the wind that night was exceptionally fast and spread burning debris across neighborhoods easily. The whole city of Chicago only had 185 tired, overworked firefighters at their expense, and small machines that were not very effective. That paired with the old dry wood was not a good combination.
As it was a warm night on October 9th, 1871, when the wind was a little faster and drier than usual, when Miss Catherine O'Leary was milking her cow in the barn on 137 DeKoven Street, when the cow allegedly kicked over a lit lantern and the barn caught fire after that. A man named Dennis Sullivan discovered the fire in the barn and started yelling "fire," alerting the town of what's happening as the firefighters got ready and as the wind picked up. Debris began to fly out onto the street and quickly engulf the buildings. When the firefighters arrived, they quickly noticed that they had been directed towards the wrong address. People that lived on that street gave their best effort towards stopping the fire, using methods such as opening the fire hydrant. Everything in the area around the barn started to burn, and it did not stop. It traveled from the south side up towards the north and kept going. It headed towards the Chicago River, which many people thought was a block to stop the fire, but that was wrong. Debris flew onto the roofs of the buildings across the river and did not stop for a while. At 11:30, the mayor, Roswell B. Mason, began to call neighboring towns for help, and as the courthouse caught fire, He told everyone to escape the building and release some criminals from the basement. By the end of the first night, the city was in wreckage, and the fire was still persisting. As the chaos pursued, the citizens looked as if there was no end in sight.
On the second day of the Great Chicago Fire, at about 2:30 a.m., the cupola of the courthouse broke apart. A cupola is an architectural design that includes a big dome on the top of a building that serves as a lookout or ventilation, but sometimes it holds a bell. This particular one had a bell. When it hit the ground, reportedly, people could hear the noise from over a mile away. Here is a picture depicting the courthouse before it was destroyed in the fire. Despite that, the firefighters were still working and the terror was not stopping. Later, some of the wreckage was picked up by a firewall and headed directly toward a train car filled with kerosene. It exploded, only worsening the fire and bringing it towards the north side. A phenomenon known as the firewhirl, where really hot air mixes with cool air, creates a tornado-like effect and is one of the main reasons why the fire was so out of control. In the evening, the rain started, this being a major factor in putting out the fire. By this time, the fire had already begun to clear out the north side, slowly coming to a halt. After being slowed down by buildings that were demolished in the upper north side of Chicago, it trapped the fire as the vacant lot served as a barrier.
After the fire was completely gone, the great rebuilding of Chicago started immediately. So fast, people started building before the architect and engineers had completed the design. New laws were passed, making it so more buildings had to be built out of brick, stone, marble, and limestone. Because of these new, more expensive building materials, many more poor people from Chicago couldn't afford the new fireproof material, or people could not afford fire insurance. So without being able to make sure their houses weren't going to burn again or have insurance on their houses, thousands of people and small businesses fled out of Chicago. 3 days after the fire started, a man named William Bross, devastated at the sight of Chicago, said, "Cheer up. In the midst of calamity, without parallel in the world's history, looking upon the ashes of 30 years' accumulations, the people of once this beautiful city, I have resolved that Chicago shall rise again." Chicago was then fully built back in 5 years and would reach a population of 1 million by the turn of the century.
The Great Chicago Fire affected many different things, but one thing we have not talked about a lot is the economic aspect of the damages. In the city alone, Chicago lost over $5.2 billion in damages from the fire. But it also affected a ton of other state businesses. For New York alone, they lost over $500 million, and that is just one state out of the 15 others. I believe that if this fire did not happen, then Chicago would have been a much bigger city and would have greatly benefited from the extra $5.2 billion. The rights of the townspeople of Chicago was safety and the right to live. The right of safety was confiscated from over 1/3 of the city's population, or 100,000 people, and in turn made them live on the street. Even though the fire was not the government's fault, they are still responsible for taking care and making sure their citizens are safe. Another right the townspeople had was the right to demand funding for the houses that got destroyed during the fire and their assets that they lost. One example is the responsibility of the townspeople to rebuild their city, either with or without the help of the government. It is also the responsibility to prevent future fires and other disasters from occurring by taking precautions like being aware of your surroundings and properly alerting the authorities.
In conclusion, the Great Chicago Fire was one of the most impactful and important fires ever. With the effects left on history, and especially American history, we can now see that we learned something from the Great Chicago Fire, and that it pushed society forward, and now fires are less commonly seen in American cities.